The second lesson this morning, the familiar words of the 13th chapter of 1 Corinthians. I may speak in tongues of men or of angels, but if I am without love, I am a sounding gong or a clanging cymbal. I may have the gift of prophecy and know every hidden truth. I may have faith strong enough to move mountains, but if I have no love, I am nothing. I may dole out all I possess or even give my body to be burned, but if I have no love, I am none the better. Love is patient, love is kind, and envies no one. Love is never boastful, nor conceited, nor rude, nor selfish, nor quick to take offense. Love keeps no score of wrongs, does not gloat over other men's sins, but delights in the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Let us bow for a moment. God, grant us in this time apart the readiness of mind and the openness of heart to hear a word which may be to us strength and courage and life. In the Spirit of Jesus, Amen. Anatole Brouillard, one-time book critic for the New York Times, wrote a book himself called Men, Women, and Other Anticlimaxes. In it, there's a chapter entitled The Last Married Couple in Connecticut. He writes, "It's been raining in Connecticut, and all our friends are divorcing. Perhaps the pulling up of so many roots, he speculates, will change the ecological balance and Connecticut will wash out to sea. What will the new society be like?" he asks. "The men will leave, of course, and the women remain. Will the women roam the fields in packs or hide like Gothic heroines behind drawn shades and locked doors? Will the men all sit at bars in New York after 57 games of squash, staring emptily into their beers? Will Brouillard himself be safe in the suburbs as the only man remaining? At night, he and his wife lie quietly in bed, talking about all their divorced friends. They look at each other, the last married couple in Connecticut. The thing they've always dreaded has come about. They are alone together." Well, it's a bit of a reach, but it does point to something going on out there, something happening. That's not a personal confession. I'm happily married. I mean, to us as a people in general, all kinds of studies indicate that we're having difficulty with one another. I look at the couples who stand before me at this altar, will stand this afternoon, in fact, so glowing, so serious, so deeply in love, and I wonder if they will make it, knowing that half of them will not. I ask a friend how his daughter is doing, and he comments rather sadly that she's just gone through a divorce. Now, I'm really not passing judgment on individual situations this morning. Divorce does happen and happens to some of the best. Relationships do break down to the point where, like Humpty Dumpty, they can't be put back together again, especially where abuse or even violence, in fact, destroys a relationship. There's failure involved, but then human beings do fail, always have and always will, and God does forgive and tell us to get on with life. But I'm asking why us, so generally in our time, why we have so much trouble with this institution and with the family, child abuse. In our corner of the world, child neglect seems more likely, at least more in evidence. Many parents spend less and less time with their children, seem less willing to man the Sunday schools and the scout troops, preferring to farm them out to someone else who will hopefully care. A series in the newspaper not long ago bemoans the growing tendency of parents to rush their troubled and troubling adolescents off to the psych ward. And of course, in the larger society, there's the growing disrespect and disregard for the rights and feelings of others, the widespread irritation, bad manners, even violent behavior. Now, of course, this has always been true in one measure or another of us. We are not absolutely unique, as we are prone to think, not even in our capacity for sinning. And the root cause for our difficulty with one another, I suspect, is the same as it's always been. It's our propensity to be more concerned with ourselves, our own security, our own needs, our own desires, our own pleasures, our own fulfillment than those of others. The fact is, when forced to choose between our duty to others and our own safety and comfort, many of us choose ourselves all of the time, and all of us do some of the time. But we do seem to be having more of a time with one another than in some other eras, or at least so the studies and statistics are telling us. And love is what it's all about, isn't it? The capacity to care, really care about the other guy or gal or little ones, the fellow journeyer upon life's way. That's what the songs keep telling us, of course. That's what this old book is finally about. This is my commandment, that you love one another. If you have not love, you are nothing. So what is it about love that is so hard for us moderns? One veteran comes home suffering scarring facial burns from combat. He's brought to a veterans hospital. His wife finally arrives, walks into his hospital room, takes one look at him, removes her wedding rings, places them on his stomach, and walks out. Another, David Rover, nearly dies when a phosphorus grenade explodes 6 inches from his left ear. He survives, but pretty badly disfigured. He describes his reunion with his pretty young wife, Brenda. After returning to the States, Brenda walked straight to my bed, paused at the chart, read the tag on my arm, showed not the slightest tremor of horror or shock, bent over and kissed me on what was left of my face. Then she looked me in my good eye, smiled and said, "Welcome home, Davy. I love you." All I could say was, "I want you to know I'm real sorry." She said, "Why are you sorry?" "Because I can never look good for you again." She grinned and said, "Oh, Davy, you were never any good looking anyway." What's the difference? Why do some run and others stay? Why do some go on loving somehow and others say, "I just don't love him anymore"? I find a little hint in the words of Jesus and Paul about love. Right in the heart of their talk, there is reference to pain and hurt and sacrifice. What is Jesus' test of love? Whether you're willing to hurt for it, even die for it. How does Paul define love finally? Love not only believes and hopes, it bears and endures all things. Which is to say, love is finally not a sentiment, a warm feeling. If it is, then you and I probably fall in and out of love many times every day. Love is rather the willingness, the commitment, the determination to care for the other, even when it doesn't feel good, when it hurts, when it means sacrifice, discomfort, pain, not to mention inconvenience. Real love is always for better or for worse. So love is a real pain. To be a parent is a pain. That's why I liked the late Irma Bombeck. For all her craziness, she knew where it was at when it came to parenting, whether little children or older ones. She wrote once, "If you want to stir up a hornet's nest, just ask mothers which are harder to raise, boys or girls. The answer will depend upon whether they're raising boys or girls." I've had both, so I'll settle the argument once for all. The girls. With boys, you always know where you stand, right in the path of a hurricane. It's all there, the fruit flies hovering over their waste can, the hamster trying to escape to cleaner air, the bedrooms decorated in early bus station restroom. With girls, everything looks great on the surface, but beware of the drawers that won't open. They contain a 3-month supply of dirty underwear, unwashed hose, and rubber bands with blobs of hair in them. You have to wonder about a girl's bedroom when you go in to make her bed and her dolls have a look of fear and disbelief in their eyes. A mother once wrote to me, "After giving birth to 3 boys, I finally got a girl on my 4th try. At first, she did all the sweet things I'd longed to see. Then she turned 14 months and she struck like a hurricane. When she discovered she could no longer sail down the banister and make my hair stand on end, she turned to streaking. I'd dress her ever so sweetly and go to breakfast dishes. Before one glass was washed, she'd strip, unlock the door, and start cruising the neighborhood. One day, the dry cleaner made a delivery and said, 'My goodness, I hardly recognize Stacy with her clothes on.' I knew of a mother who said, boys are honest. Whenever you yell upstairs, what's all that thumping about? You get a upfront reply. Joey threw the cat down the clothes chute. It was cool. When my daughter is upstairs playing with her dolls, I yell, what are your girls doing? And she answers sweetly, nothing. I have to find out for myself that they're making cookies out of my new bath powder and jar of moisturizer. And it's humorous because we identify the realities of parenting and yet can view the pain from a distance, especially if we're grandparents. But loving children is painful. It infringes upon our rights, our fun, our free time. You have to be on duty when you don't feel like being on duty. By definition, nurture of children requires sacrifice of time and denial of some of our own desires. And you are emotionally vulnerable before immature creatures who are not sensitive to that invulnerability. To be a real parent, even of grown-up children, is to suffer. To be married is a pain. Again, no true confessions, just a general observation. It's right there in the wedding ceremony, isn't it? In joy and in sorrow. Of course, not being married is a pain also. Indeed, a study in Denmark, where a lot of people don't get married these days, establishes that married men live 8 years longer than unmarried. Interesting. What I mean is that life together, in whatever kind of relationship, by its very nature involves times when bearing and enduring takes precedence, where because of illness or crisis or weakness or imperfection, all the things that are part of being human, we become burdened to one another, we hurt with one another, we go through real tough times with one another. Judith Viors, I think, paints this reality in a rather oblique way in her poem called The Whole Truth. He always called her honey, and she always called him sweetie, and he always brought her flowers, and she always stroked his hair. Their beautiful relationship was what a marriage should be, and the rest of us regarded it with envy and despair. She always called him lover, and he always called her baby, and she always praised his brilliance, and he always praised her wit. No wife was more adoring, and no husband more devoted, and the rest of us were jealous, I'm embarrassed to admit. He always called her dearest, and she always called him darling, and he always hugged and kissed her, and she always held him tight. They just announced they're filing for divorce tomorrow morning, and the news has filled the rest of us with absolute delight. Real human relationships involve inevitably bearing and enduring and putting up with and getting along with, caring for the other when you're exhausted. And we live, do we not, in a culture that has taught us to run from all that, encouraged us to believe that there's a quick fix from every discomfort, teased us into thinking that life can and should be pain-free. Prescription drugs to booze, we've become convinced that we can swallow something and hurt no more. It's possible to grow up in this world of marvelous electronic and technological wonders with very little real discomfort for a while. Very little agony that cannot be drugged. Very little dissatisfaction that can't be eased with a quick purchase. You know, the problem with stress is generally not the existence of stress. Stress is part of life. It is the lack of a developed ability to deal with it, a commitment to deal with it. And that goes for us as adults as much for the kids. Growing up into useful, disciplined, contributing lives means progressively learning to accept our share of the suffering and pain that comes, the hurt that comes, with trying to be productive and creative and helpful and there for one another. All the wise of all the centuries have always insisted on this. Only when we learn to embrace the inevitable ups and downs of life, learn to accept our share of the miseries and troubles that go with life together, do we discover what the deep joys and the permanent rewards are all about. So if we're having such trouble with one another in our time, perhaps it's because we've not learned this. Learn to accept and embrace pain and trouble as part of real life. There's an old rabbinic tale. Rabbi Shmelka and his brother visited the rabbi of Metzrich, and they asked him, Our sages have said certain words which leave us no peace of mind because we can't understand them. The words are that men should praise and thank God for suffering just as much as for well-being and receive it with the same joy. Will you tell us how we can possibly understand this, Rabbi? The rabbi replied, go to the house of study. There you'll find Zuzia smoking his pipe. He'll give you the answer. They went to the house of study and put their question to Rabbi Zuzia, and he laughed. You certainly haven't come to the right person. Better to go to someone else rather than to me, because I've really never experienced much suffering. But the two of them knew better. They knew that from the day he had been born to this day, Rabbi Zuzia's life had been a web of need and trouble. But then they knew what the answer was, to accept one's suffering with love. Because to love is to suffer, and to accept the suffering for the sake of the loving is to find the suffering is itself transformed. And there is in the midst of it, at the heart of it, a quiet joy. I think this point is made most beautifully in a piece that I ran across a number of years ago by Mike Harden, a columnist for the Columbus Dispatch. It's rather lengthy, but I think too beautiful to abbreviate very much. When Frank Steger pushed himself into an upright position in the hospital bed, the heart monitor's fluid cursive line disintegrated into an erratic scribble. I told the doctor, he said, peeking at the edge of the curtain to make sure that his wife Mary was not within earshot, I told the doctor that I felt like I was drowning. The doctor said, this is what happens with congestive heart disease. I told him I'd rather he threw me off the roof first. Mary returned to the room, drawing a chair to his bedside. Thirsty, he complained. She lifted the straw to his lips as he pulled the oxygen mask aside. The medicine made him sick. She fetched the basin, wrapped a firm arm around his spasm-racked shoulders, mopped the sweat from his forehead. In sickness and in health, they were supposed to be preparing for a Florida vacation, not holding on to each other in the cardiac care unit. Help me sit up, he whispered hoarsely. So in the end, love comes down to this, not Clark Gable's devilish first appraisal of Vivian Lee, not Burt Lancaster and Deborah Kerr rolling in the surf, but help me sit up. Sharp-toothed rain spattered against the window pane. In the room, a procession of medical courtiers came and went, trading pills for blood and tinkering, ever tinkering with the buttons and dials, controlling the tubes and wires to which their patient was trussed up like some latter-day Gulliver. He and Mary indulged the visitors when they came, who tiptoed in, fumbled over measured words of encouragement, punctuated by the beeps and buzzers of machines, monitoring his vital signs, then tiptoed out. The obvious, the inevitable, make all parties secretly grateful for limited visiting hours, not least among them were Frank and Mary. One evening, Frank was asleep, sitting up in the chair next to the bed. Mary paused in the waiting room to remove her street shoes and put on her slippers. She didn't want to wake him now that sleep was such a rationed luxury. Soundlessly, she slipped into the chair next to his. In the end, love is not the smoldering glance across the dance floor, the clink of crystal, the leisurely picnic spread upon summer's clover. It's the squeeze of a hand. I'm here, I'll be here, no matter how long the fight, even when you want most to close your eyes and be done with it. Water, you need water, here, drink, let me straighten your pillow. Help me into bed, he said. He who once had been a warrior triumphant in the business world, he was tough, demanding, but never as much on others as himself. If you gave him your best, no one could hurt you. If you gave him less, no one could hide you. She had been beside him when the future was golden, beside him when health sent his career into collapse. I'm thirsty, he said. Here, she said, I'll get you something. Along the road they had once traveled so often to visit family, the hearse wound its way past stubbled fields, shuttered roadside markets. The minister, clutching his Bible against his chest as though it alone was sufficient cloak against the wind whipping across the rural countryside, passed final benediction, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. He stooped to pick up his hat as the funeral director placed the folded flag in Mary's lap. When all is said and done, love is not rapture and fire. It is a hand steadier than one's own, squeezing harder than a heartbeat. Wine changes back to water. Endearment is exhibited by what once would have been considered insignificant kindness, but which in the end becomes the tenderest of ministrations. On the day after the funeral, trying to busy herself with chores that could wait, she plopped the laundry basket in front of her granddaughter. The child tugged out the end of the sheet her Frank had always held when they did the wash. When the child brought the folded end to meet the corners her grandmother held, she kissed her playfully, just as he had once done. "I'm thirsty, Grandma. Here, let me get you something." Love bears all things, endures all things. How can we possibly be up to it, learn its rewards? Maybe we inch toward it as we remember week in and week out here that there's another Father who hurts because of our stupidities and failures, who hurts because of our lack of appreciation of who we are, who hurts because of our neglect of Him and His cause and His children, who hurts and nevertheless accepts the hurt and goes on loving, hangs in there something like a man on a cross who would not quit His people, but laid down His life for them all, for us all, in love. In love.